Some people claiming that after patch 1.5 HDR in Cyberpunk looks different. Let's have a look. I made already a video about the HDR settings in Cyberpunk last year, I think it was in October, but the thing is, if I would use now the exact same settings, it doesn't look right anymore. At this stage I have no idea what's going on, but there are just two possible options. First option is my settings, my values back then were completely wrong. Second option is they actually improved HDR with the latest patch. But to be very honest, at the end it really doesn't matter, because today I have new settings for you. Let's start as always with the basics. It really doesn't matter how you set up the HDR calibration menu on the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series X, because the game does not support the HDR calibration menu on the consoles. Back then when I made my first video about HDR in Cyberpunk, I found a very weird behavior. As soon you used Dolby Vision and 120 Hz, you had Black Level rays, and this was just in this combination, not in HDR10 at all and not in 60 Hz and Dolby Vision. I looked very closely this time, but I couldn't find any HDR Black Level rays at all. Not in HDR10, not in Dolby Vision, not in 60 and not in 120 Hz. It looks like it's resolved. Okay, so let's talk about my recommended settings for HDR, and we're starting with HDR10. But before we do this, we always need to keep in mind that all my settings, all my recommendations are based on my LG CX 65-inch. And even you have exactly the same TV at home, it is most likely not the same outcome, because I'm using most likely a complete different calibration. And yes, I will do an updated settings video for my picture modis very soon, okay, because I'm getting a lot of requests for this. But before I can do this, I need to actually verify if my calibration is still as I like it, okay. But again, keep in mind, my settings here are for my TV. But nevertheless, let's start talking about my settings for HDR10 and HGiG. And by the way, the same settings are for dynamic tone mapping on as well, because I found there is and there shouldn't actually any difference between HGiG and dynamic tone mapping on settings, because both HDR modes are using the same capability from the TV. It is just a different approach how they display HDR on the screen. So that's all, okay? So that's why I found HGiG and dynamic tone mapping on exactly the same settings. Maximum peak brightness for HDR10 is 800, and tone mapping midpoint I found the best value for my TV is between 1.6 and 1.8. The standard setting is actually 2.0, and I found it is too much for my TV, because you will already lose some very fine details and very bright objects, and it's no option actually to reduce the maximum peak brightness, because yeah, that's the maximum peak brightness from our TV. What we need to change or adjust is actually the tone mapping midpoint, and again I found between 1.6 and 1.8 it's a perfect value for my TV. And then of course we have the value paper white, which is really just or purely just for the user interface, and I have set this to 100. Not necessarily because I'm afraid of burn in, but the problem is not really in this game, but when we're talking about an OLED TV and we have a user interface which is already very bright compared to the rest, we will lose maximum peak brightness from the TV, because the OLED TV is just capable of a certain brightness, and when we're using this brightness already with the UI, with the user interface, then we don't have this brightness left for really HDR effects. And I proved this already, I think, in Dirt 5, where I showed you how the user interface, because you have actually a lot of elements on the screen, how the user interface or the paper white settings for the user interface can change or affect the HDR maximum peak brightness. And that's why paper white is set to 100, and then we're having this great HDR picture. And by the way, this is HGiG, and that's my recommendation. If you play this game in HDR10, use HGiG, because you get this, and this is almost 700 candela, 650 or whatever. Very bright, and not just in terms of the maximum peak brightness. I found that in terms of the base brightness, there is nothing to complain about, because as you hopefully can see on your screen at the moment, I hope my camera can catch this, but I have no problems at all to see details in this dark corner, even with all my lights on. And usually I'm playing in a almost dark, complete dark room. But in this case, it looks to me they improved HDR in not just the maximum peak brightness, also in base brightness, because this is more than playable, absolutely perfectly playable in HDR10 and HGiG. But I also found something what I can't really explain. So with the settings what I showed you before, 800, tone mapping 1.6 to 1.8 and user interface 100, at this very moment the game is asking to output 720 nits, which is absolutely fine, and my TV can handle this perfectly. But with exactly the same settings, I measured or analyzed this screenshot, and right now the game would actually ask to output 1000 nits, which of course is way too much. And when we just have a look here in the luminance heat map, you can see it's completely red, which means it's really in the 1000 range, which is way over the capabilities from the LG CX. And that's the reason why some objects, not all of the objects, but some objects are just looking a little bit oversaturated and just over brightened. And really just some objects like this, because this here on the other hand with 797 is absolutely fine. And when we have a look here on the heat map, you can see there's nothing red at all. We just having actually orange parts, which is absolutely fine. And my LG CX has no problem with that. But nevertheless, I decided to keep my settings exactly how they are, because there is no point to reduce the maximum peak brightness to, let's say, 600 just to meet the maximum peak brightness from my TV on certain objects. It doesn't make sense, because I would lose so much peak brightness on other objects and it's just not worth it. And to be very honest, reducing the maximum peak brightness below 800 will just end up in a not very nice HDR picture, in my opinion, on my LG CX. So again, for HDR10, maximum brightness 800, tone mapping midpoint between 1.6 and 1.8, and paper white 100. On the PlayStation 5, in the video option, we have an additional setting what we are missing on the Xbox Series. But to be very honest, we don't need this, because all what this setting is doing, HDR mode, is enabling or disabling HDR. So if you like to play in HDR, I would strongly recommend to keep this off and do not use none. By the way, when you use none, you have just the SDR picture output. That's why you just have now the gamma correction instead of the HDR settings. And by the way, standard setting is 1, but this setting does not affect the HDR settings at all. That's very, very good. But again, don't turn this off, because otherwise you're ending up, instead of having 630 candela here, you just have around 220 candela. Okay, let's start talking about Dolby Vision and my recommended settings. Maximum brightness is set to 950, and you can see already there's a difference compared to HDR10. Tone mapping midpoint is set to 2, but the range I would actually recommend is 1.8 to 2. Paper white set to 100, exactly the same as with HDR10. Now the question is, why do I have different settings compared to HDR10? Because if I would use the exact same settings in Dolby Vision as in HDR10, I would end up with a different maximum peak brightness in very bright objects like this lamp. Instead of having 660 candela in HDR10, I would end up with 613 candela. Changing the maximum peak brightness to 950 gives me back 660 candela. And now the question is, of course, HGiG or dynamic tone mapping on in HDR10, but this is absolutely up to you. If you like to have a higher base brightness, and you can see what dynamic tone mapping on is doing at this very moment, then go for it, because especially when you play in a brighter environment, then dynamic tone mapping on is most likely the better choice. I'm very happy with HGiG because I'm playing in an almost complete dark room. So just keep in mind that when you have bright objects on the screen like this lamp here, then dynamic tone mapping on or HGiG, there's zero difference anymore. In certain situations, it can be that dynamic tone mapping on is even a little bit darker compared to HGiG, okay? So just keep this in mind. Dynamic tone mapping on is not improving the maximum peak brightness from your TV. Next question is Dolby Vision or HGiG? Which one is better? And to be very honest, I can't tell you. The only thing what I can tell you is that Dolby Vision, the colors in Dolby Vision are looking a little bit different compared to HDR10 HGiG. But this can be because of my calibration from the TV. When I'm switching between HDR10 or Dolby Vision, I am not able to tell a difference actually beside the little color difference in terms of shadow details, in terms of brightness. It looks very, very similar. I would actually need two TVs perfectly calibrated side by side, and then maybe I would be able to tell a difference. Okay, my friends, and I'm not kidding you when I tell you that this video took me around, or actually over 6 hours to produce, to edit and to upload. So if you're new to my channel, I would much appreciate if you would subscribe, leave me a like, and of course leave me a comment as well. So now I really hope that I didn't miss anything in terms of the HDR recommendation for Cyberpunk 2077. I put a lot of work in, and if I missed anything, just put it in the comment section and I will do my very best, maybe with a follow-up video. But for now, I think that's enough. And yeah, thank you very much for watching me. I see you guys in my next video. Bye.